everyone, welcome again to another episode of the Growth Design Podcast. With me, I've got my amazing co host, Emmanuel.
Hi guys, hi. Good to be here again.
All right, and with us today, we've got a very special guest. His name is Olusegun Adebajo, and he is a product growth designer at Rocket Homes, a real estate tech platform and home ownership company. He's been with the company nearly 6 years, 2018 till now, and has been on the growth team working on optimization and experimentation for 4 of those years. In his time at Rocket Homes, Shegun has been involved in nearly 200 experiments and currently, he has been seeking out mentors on ADP lists, 17 sessions in 3 months. Amazing. As he's on a mission to level up into a senior role. I'm super pumped to have you with us today, Shegun. How are you?
I'm great, and thank you for that intro. I'm also very excited to have this conversation with you both. I hear and see great things for this podcast. Happy to be here today.
Thanks for those kind words too. Good to have you here.
So, in today's episode, we're going to be continuing with our series, The Growth Design Career Playbook. And for this episode with Shegun, we're going to be exploring conversations around finding growth opportunities within your existing design role. So, Shegun, can you share with us, just give us a brief introduction into your background in design? Was there a particular moment that led you into design, or you just seem to have a knack for creative things and decided to pursue design?
Yeah, actually, for the entirety of my professional career, I've always been in design. I actually come from a traditional graphic design background. And then once I sort of got into that industry space, I started off my journey as a graphic designer in a marketing agency. I did that for a few years, which was a great experience, and then started to sort of transition from traditional graphic design into more of the human-centered design, human-computer interaction world, and have been sort of in that product design discipline for 7-8 years now.
Amazing. So, how about growth design? What drew you to growth design in the first place?
Yeah, I mean, that's actually a funny and ironic story. Like, the first time I heard about growth design, I heard it from my manager. And prior to that, I think the most that I knew was anecdotally about growth hacking. So, like, those two worlds didn't really actually collide in my head. So, when my manager came to the team and he was like, okay, we're going to start doing experimentation, it's going to be a lot of A/B testing. I was like, wait, what? What's going on? And so actually I was introduced to growth design more at the experimentation level, and not the term wasn't actually thrown around. It was just more like, we're looking for ways to optimize the experience, and we're just going to dive right into it. So it was a very organic, hands-on, and sort of a sudden change in direction for the company as well as for the design org.
So, what would you then say from that experience? Well, which technically could be an experiment, right?
For
Because
sure.
they just came, your manager came and said the entire team was going to start doing A/B tests and things like that. What mindset shifts did you begin to notice as you started to work on growth initiatives compared to your usual product design thinking background, for example?
Yeah, so I think the first major mindset shift was looking at design as a messy environment, right? So design became less precious and very much more scrappy. For designers, we take our work very seriously. We, protect the fidelity of our work, and treat the whole process as this very precious gem, right? Sometimes we don't even want to show what we're working on until it's finished. But then you come into experimentation and growth design, it's almost like they're asking to see you're working. Like what happens
Yeah.
behind closed doors, that's what they want to see. So get scrappy, get messy. That was sort of the first mindset shift, which was quite welcome because it kind of lowers the stakes and welcomes a lot more of that figuring it out process, which kind of leads me to that second mindset, which is embracing failure. Like in growth, let's say you run 100 experiments, the majority of those experiments are expected to fail, right? And so you kind of have to have an appetite for failure. So don't be afraid to be wrong. Don't be afraid to not know the answers. Don't be afraid to do the trial and error approach to figuring things out. So that was definitely the second mindset, embracing failure. And it kind of also lowers the risk. So in terms of knowing that you're operating at much tighter and quicker loops of iteration, you can, put something out there in its most like fundamental form and not be so hung up on, the final polish, because the experiment is supposed to only run for a short period of time. And if it does actually turn out to be a winner, then you have the opportunity to, work with, the developers, refine certain aspects of it, or even build out other aspects, because again, you could be running that experiment on a specific audience, right? And so you're only factoring in what's the experience for that audience. And if it does win, then you have the opportunity to say, well, what's the experience for the rest of the users on the platform? I think the third mindset shift I would say is sort of thinking in systems. So again, you're operating at this like incremental continuous improvement approach, and you need to be able to switch your perspective. So for example, you're looking at the analytics for a specific user task or user flow, and you're looking at the points in that flow where there's like a drop in the funnel, and you come up with a bunch of ideas. One idea could be tackling the quote unquote problem at the surface level. So like looking at the UI, is there something you can improve in the UI? So that's one perspective. And then the other perspective is looking at that same problem, that same like choke point in your funnel, and saying what's the deeper underlying issue, right?
Hmm.
And then depending on what altitude you're focusing on for that experiment, you can sort of scale up the impact of the changes that you're making to the system.
I love that. I really enjoyed how you've laid out the mindset. I'm curious, what has been your biggest challenge when making that shift? Where did you experience the most resistance personally?
I think when we started out, right, like I mentioned, we started off being very scrappy, and a lot of that beginning was focused around for the team developing sort of the mindset of experimentation. So in the sense where really going through the motions to kind of develop a muscle memory in a sense of, okay, so this is a process of experimentation. And so when you're in that stage in terms of maturity of the practice, you can get really oriented around, okay, I've sort of launched X number of experiments, so you're really focused on like the quantity of experiments, right? So it's like experiment after experiment after experiment. You kind of build this appetite and the rigor for doing experimentation. But once you start like thinking about the different contexts, thinking about the different like altitudes, you're sacrificing a bit of that agility for a bit more depth behind why are you actually experimenting on that. Like you get to like pause a little bit and ask much more deeper questions to kind of go from surface level to like skin deep. That was a bit of a shift.
Yeah, I mean, I can imagine if you've spent as long or any number of time, amount of time really with product design, it's all about the depth, right? And getting things right and getting it polished HD, and then moving from that into quick movements can just be an adjustment. So, for people who are considering making these shift at the moment or find themselves in that kind of scenario where you did, what would you then say to them? Like, what are the lessons that you've learned from that phase that you would share with them right now?
So I think like the number one lesson I would say is, just because you're trying to move a lot quicker and you're operating in more shorter incremental loops, you're not actually sacrificing the quality of your work, right? It's just now you're taking in a lot more context. For example, in core design, you do your research, understand the user's pain point, you come up with solutions for that problem, and then you go into your high fidelity prototyping and do all the usability testing, and then you eventually like launch a feature. So the difference is in growth, you start thinking about other contexts beyond the user that are just as important as the user. For example, the business context, the sort of objectives that the company is working towards. Like, why are we building the feature? Yes, it's to solve the user's problem, but how does it actually help the business in terms of differentiating itself from its competitors? How does that feature get adopted by users? A lot of times in core design, after you've launched a feature, you kind of move on to the next thing. But with growth, you're kind of
Mm,
staying on top of it in terms of,
Yeah.
okay, now the feature is launched. Is it doing exactly what we said it would do? Because in the research phase, building out that feature, you get to understand the user from an attitudinal point of view. But then
mm,
once the product or the feature is in the wild, you're now much more concerned with the behavioral point of view
mm,
of the user. So we talked to the user in research, they said they said X. And then we put the feature in their hands in the product and they're doing B, right? So there's usually a shift when it comes down to the brass tacks of how the user is actually using it. And if the user isn't using it the way you expected it to be used, how does that
mm,
impact the business metrics? Yeah. So I think that's one of the big things.
mm. Yeah, in making a case for growth design, you mentioned it was a case of your manager starting to say that experiments and things were going to begin, right? But obviously, in the early stages, you still have to do quite a bit of work to begin to understand how to spot growth design opportunities, how to figure out what changes need to be implemented, right? Can you share more about the importance of understanding your company's goals and users' needs as a foundation for you to be able to find the right growth levers to pull as a growth designer?
Yeah, absolutely. When we started out doing growth experiments, we were not experts by any means as far as growth was concerned. And because of the pace that we were moving at, we kind of started to focus around number of experiments, right? But the experiments themselves were not an end in themselves. When you run an experiment, you also learn something, whether the experiment was a success or a failure. The learning was also a product of sort of the experimentation that we were doing, right? And so one thing that I started to wonder was, well, first of all, what was out there in terms of other companies and how they were adopting growth. I started to get tired of that like monotony, right? Okay, we're running this experiment, and at that level of practicing growth, we were also sort of shifting focus very rapidly. So for a little while we would focus on retention, and then for a little while we'll focus on engagement, and then for a little while we'll focus on conversion. But there wasn't any kind of strategy behind it. There wasn't a rhyme or reason. It was just, okay, we've looked at the funnels, we've seen some opportunities to run an experiment, and then we just sort of come up with our experiment ideas, our hypotheses, and then run with that. But I felt like something was missing, right? In trying to understand the point of it all. Like, how does it funnel up to bigger goals? How does it connect to, what the other teams are doing? And so I started to, seek that knowledge. And that's around the time I came across the concept of product-led growth, where, you're thinking about things a little bit more strategically. You're connecting what you're doing in activation to what you're doing in
Mm,
acquisition. You're connecting that to onboarding. And so like my mind started to expand around what are the possibilities with growth design, and not just like focus on experimentation. There's got to be a bigger story to
mm.
Mm.
what you're doing and why you're doing it.
Hmm. All right. Yeah, that's a really great point you make. How did you then begin to propose new growth initiatives? Because if you were saying that you were starting to see how there was a need for strategy, there was a need for growth internally, right? To be able to understand what to do. How did you find a roadmap? How did you propose growth initiatives with your team or to management? Including how did you end up building like a business case or demonstrate the potential ROI in your thinking of the different kind of experiments that you could run around various segments?
Let me preface that response with just, I guess, a bit more context around the growth team and how like we've evolved over time. So like
Yeah.
I've been on the growth team at Rocket Homes now for going on 4 years. And like I mentioned earlier, like when we started, we didn't have any background into growth. And it was just more like get used to, sort of the mindset around growth. Right. And once we got comfortable with that, we kind of started coasting in a sense. And then I started asking questions around, okay, yes, this experiment was a success. How does it like, sort of trickle down the funnel?
Oh, nice.
How does it impact the business objectives? And I started to sort of identify the gaps in terms of our approach as well as our process. I felt like we could make some improvements in terms of the approach that we did, as well as the process around experimentation, right? And so because I started asking those questions, I started, sort of seeking that knowledge, those knowledge gaps. I started, reading articles about how other companies approach growth experimentation. And I came across this talk from a product conference where the lady was VP of product at Netflix. And so she talked about this approach to experimentation where, they use experimentation to de-risk big bets. And that sort of got my wheels turning and got really curious. So in that approach, they have 80% of their resources that's allotted to, things like your quick wins, low hanging fruit experiments. So your small bets and medium bets, right? But then 20% they allot to big bets. So that in itself was already something that we were missing. And I could already see how, adopting that kind of approach will elevate the work that we did, bring in, the opportunity to craft experimentation around much more strategic initiatives. In that talk, she also mentioned how the small bets and the medium bets are all opportunities to learn, and all the learnings that you do with those experiments feed up to validating some of those big bet ideas, right? So it's kind of like you could also think about working backwards from the big bet, right? So if you have this big initiative, because of the scale and the scope of the idea that you want to run in an experiment, it comes with a lot of risk, right? So it's kind of like high risk, high reward, right? So you already anticipate there's going to be bigger gains, bigger impact in the metrics if you were to prove that this idea was successful, right? So you kind of work backwards from there. It's like, how do we break down this big idea into much smaller pieces that come with less risk to kind of prove out a number of things that need to be true if that big idea is going to work? And so that was something that I uncovered and sort of brought to the team. And then we started talking through the possibility of, because of adopting a new approach like this, how will it impact the process around our experimentation? Because at the same time, we also want to keep a much more balanced approach where you have a mix of all of those things. We were kind of stuck because we didn't have the big bets, right? So we're kind of just going in this sort of loop of little experiments that actually are not following up. And so when you have that big initiative or big idea that you want to run an experiment with, you're also looking to impact the product and the business at a much higher altitude, right? So you've looked at what are the business goals, what are the current objectives and the key results that the business is focused on, because those things rarely change within a given period, right? And so you have a much more solid base to work off of. With these big initiatives, because they're tied to the company's objectives and the key results, they're not going to be changing much, which means the opportunity for impact is a lot higher. So once you understand the business goals and you sort of tie that initiative to the business goals, it's something that you can sort of pursue long term. And at that altitude as well, you're also looking at the deeper, user needs and pain points. Right. So deeper user needs and pain points are also things that are not going to change. It's kind of like the sole or the main reason why the users are in your product and sort of doing business with your company in the first place, right? So those things become foundational to the ideas that you develop around your experimentation.
I'm curious then, because you mentioned that you sort of use that idea of de-risking big initiatives, right? Like, what challenges did you face during that period that you just really struggled to figure out or overcome, or even maybe an experiment that had been hedged against a big bet and just failed, and you had to go back to the drawing board to figure it out?
Yeah, so I think the two major challenges that I've come up against are around priority and alignment, right? So in the day to day, again, you're not necessarily thinking about those big business goals, right? So you can kind of get into your routine. It's like, okay, I've hit the expectations in terms of my daily goals, in terms of experiments to be run, and then you're not looking at what's the bigger picture, what's the bigger why. So in terms of priority, some of the, I guess, challenges that came up when I was bringing the idea to the team was, how are you going to sort of pursue that big initiative and still do the work that's expected of you, right? And so
Right.
that's where you kind of start to think outside the box in terms of making sure that your team still trusts you to do the work that's priority, which means how to
Mm.
work around that and find time beyond work hours, at least in the early days, to kind of put together that business case, to kind of put together the presentation that I would need to get more people on board, right, to get that buy-in. And
Mm.
so tackling priority was the first challenge, and then the second challenge in terms of alignment, just getting people to understand. And that's where, like, you start to deal with your storytelling, the format of your presentation. And, one person could understand what you're proposing and be on board, but then you need the whole team to kind of be on board, right? So what you might want to then do is, let's say you've done a presentation and you haven't quite got buy-in. So then you kind of approach each member of that audience, that you're sort of speaking to kind of understand what are their current understanding, what is their concern, and what part of the initiative do they not understand. Kind of understand what their own priorities are and start to speak their language, right? So it's kind of like knowing what their priorities are. You then present your idea in a way that shows that it's not going to cause a derailment or, like a shift in priorities, or just leaving work undone on the table without any progress to those things.
Yeah, great. So, looking at the growth design profession at large, like, what are the steps that you took to familiarize yourself with growth design? Given the background you had, what are the practical approach you took to evolve yourself to become a growth designer?
One key step is just knowing what the rest of the industry is doing and what the rest of the industry thinks of growth design. Yeah, I think in the early days for me, I wasn't doing that. It's kind of like any product development framework, right? Take Agile, for example. Companies have different spins on it, teams have different spins on it, and you adopt those frameworks and those approaches based on what you need. Right. And so when we started doing growth, we were doing it based on what we needed and what we felt was the right approach for the needs of the team as well as the business. But then again, you kind of sort of get into a routine and you're not evolving, in a sense. And so the first thing was to kind of understand what is growth design from the industry's point of view, and then you get exposed
Yeah.
to, things like product-led growth, the different types of funnels that you can build around your product, the different ways of thinking about your user. So that was sort of the first thing. And then, so now I've kind of gotten a breadth of knowledge in terms of what's out there and what's the universe of growth design. And then I wanted to now like sort of go a little deeper with regards to looking at the maturity level of the growth practice and looking for practical ways to actually evolve our practice. One of them being, the overall approach, which introduces those bigger initiatives. So that was one. And then thinking about the users. So developing your own point of view about your users. As a growth designer, when you're thinking about your users, it's a little different from, simply just being a champion of the users, representing the voice of the user. You kind of start to get a lot more into the psychology behind those behaviors that you're seeing in the data, right? And so the kind of questions that you're asking start to be a little bit different from, okay, you just need to create a new feature or a new product. So understanding the different segments of your users, what stage in each of those segments of their journey they are. And when you kind of think about the real estate industry, right? The ultimate goal for home ownership is to actually own the home. So it's a lot different from, your SaaS product, where the user journey might be shorter. The goal of the user might come with a lot less of a risk. When you're buying a home, that's a big commitment. And a lot of users kind of start on the emotional side of things. Once they get into the nitty gritty and they start realizing, the financial aspect that comes with that, and the commitment and the responsibilities that come with owning a home, their mindset starts to shift, their behavior starts to change, right? And so you want to be able to sniff out those nuances in your different audiences. So it's kind of like now I'm starting to go deep into the specific user context.
Hmm.
And I think those are like two key things that I had to do in order to develop myself as a growth designer.
Yeah, so just a follow up to that question.
Yeah.
Are there like 2, 3 resources that you could mention? Could be maybe websites or courses that you took, like resources that helped you when you were in this phase.
One, I took a course with the Nielsen Norman group on user experience management, and that kind of introduced me a lot to leading without authority. Right. So being a designer, sometimes it's easy to think, well, you need the seniority or the authority in order to make some of these strategic changes. But then I think what is more important and what I got out of that certification is just being able to speak the language of your stakeholders, being able to think about behavior as data. So that's sort of one transition in terms of being able to communicate to your stakeholders. Is you see a certain user behavior and there's a gap between what the users are doing and what the sort of expected behaviors are in order to like hit those business metrics. Exactly. So you translate those behaviors into data, right? So now you're dealing with numbers, right? But then also bringing it from the other end, which is the return on investment, for example, from a business point of view. So if you're able to speak the language of the business, then you're able to, sort of drive some of these initiatives and get the support, the buy-in that you need from stakeholders. And then that way, you start to make a lot more impact overall. In terms of other resources, I kind of gravitate a lot towards books about habits and psychology, and two that come to mind would be Atomic Habits by James Clear and How to Change by Katie Milkman, which kind of break down the idea around behavior, motivation, and habits, which from a user's point of view, this is what we're trying to understand, right? It's like we understand the behaviors that we're seeing and the habits that are sort of driving them, and then we can create the right motivators in the product environment that now allows users to take the actions that lead to business outcomes.
So during the introduction, Ini mentioned about your active participation in mentorship, like how you so much keen on mentorship and how you've been on different sections. Just curious, how important is mentorship to your journey as a growth designer, or has it impacted you as a designer?
Tremendously. I think without mentorship, I'd probably have not attempted some things that I have. Like with mentorship, you get to develop a much more holistic perspective, not just around your role, but also around the expectations of team members and leaders within your organization. So for example, the way I've approached mentorship is to kind of diversify the people that I speak to. I've spoken to designers at different levels, senior staff, principal. I've spoken to directors of design. So for example, like a director would have a specific expectation for the designers that are within their team, but the expectations would be different, say for example from the design manager or like the VP. So you're kind of like looking at your role, and the different altitudes of expectations give you a lot more well-rounded understanding of who the growth designer is within the context of the company. But then at the same time, I also talk to non-design, like cross-functional partners. So I've spoken to, researchers, I've spoken to data scientists, spoken to engineers. And again, it's just developing a much more holistic view of the role that you play and how you can actually, be impactful in that role. And so, and then obviously these people are talking from the perspective of their own experience and, the teams that they lead or the teams that they're a part of. It just kind of broadens your horizon in terms of your perspective. And that allows you to not only be better and try different things in your role, but then it kind of leads you on a path of learning as well. So a mentor can mention something, and then I want to go and dig into that a little bit more just to understand what that is and how I can actually bring it to my role. So it's definitely very critical, I would say.
Interesting. I really like the aspect where you talked about talking to different professions around the tech team, talking to PMs, talking to QAs or some other team. That's how you as a designer collaboratively work with these guys on the team, which has helped you to relate more at your work and everything. So I think it's really recommended for us designers, our product designers to, seek out mentorship so that we could also up our game in that area. So, as a product designer, right? Or what does your growth design process look like?
It really starts with the data. So, as growth designers on our team, we don't have a data analyst on the team,
Okay.
right? But we do have like a data science team that we can consult. But a lot of the initial like research into the data we do by ourselves. Like we take agency of looking out for those opportunities. So myself, the other growth designer, PM, like we're constantly in the data, and we kind of start there, in terms of what's happening in the product. How do we move users towards their goal while sort of driving those business objectives. All right, so actually maybe you want to say like it starts more at understanding the context around the user's goals and the business
Yeah.
objectives. And then you go into the data to be a lot more informed. And then we do ideation sessions, brainstorm around the opportunities that we're seeing, come up with problem statements if we're looking at much more bigger opportunities, and then we create the experiment. So we build a hypothesis, we create the success metrics, we define the change that we're trying to create, sort of establishing what is the control experience compared to the variant. Have a lot of discussion back and forth between ourselves and the developers in terms of, is the technology in place, is infrastructure in place, what are some of the concerns in terms of how we are tracking the data right now, is there more visibility needed in the data, and how does all that impact the timeline, right? But typically, like we can turn around a lot of these medium to small experiments within like a few hours to a couple of days. And then once we've sort of built out the parameters of the experiment, the developers go on to build it out. And then once that's ready, we launch it. And I've had a lot of teams actually, kind of launch an experiment and kind of leave it. It's something like a set it and forget it until the duration has been reached before they start to like dig into the data that's been captured. But we actually take the daily review of what's happening, because again, if we've introduced something into the product that is tanking very critical business metric, we want to know so that we can turn it off and like investigate and sort of respond in that sense, right? So we kind of look at the experiments that we're running very, very frequently, like on a daily basis. And then we're having live conversations between ourselves about what we're observing, what we're thinking. Do we want to call it early? Do we want to keep it running? Do we need more data to collect? And, has it reached statistical significance? All of that is happening while an experiment is running.
Within the team.
Yeah. And then once we turn it off, we then analyze the results, collect all the data, and make our observations, which we then turn into learnings that we add into like learnings library that we keep, right? Yeah, and that's pretty much the sort of life cycle.
I love that.
Interesting. Yeah, interesting. I think I learned something. Learning's library. So, how do you balance that tension between speed, that's quantity, and the polished quality as a good designer? You talked about the act of iteration and getting things out fast. So, how do you balance that tension for you as a good designer?
Yeah, that's a good question. On my team, right, like we still have monthly goals in terms of number of experiments run. It's kind of like we've sort of established a threshold in terms of, if we move at this pace, then we can assess how we're learning. So if we're moving at this pace, we're learning at that pace in terms of user behavior that we're observing through these experiments, learning
Yeah.
what doesn't work. And that sort of only brings us closer to what will actually work and make a difference in the product. So we have that threshold, like looking at our goals on a monthly basis. But then in terms of the quality, right, we have a global design system that is applied across the product. So that only adds to our ability to make these changes within the product, right? Like a lot of the experiments that we run, we're not necessarily exploring like a net new feature or like a net new experience. It's all within
Yeah.
an existing pre-existing system within the pre-existing product, so we can still bring that polish and that quality to each of the experiments that we're doing. But then quality, when you're talking about quality in terms of the depth that goes into understanding and discovering the opportunity, again, you kind of sacrifice a little bit of that speed, right? So you're not going to be able to run as many of those experiments where you're
Experiment.
looking
Yeah.
at much deeper issues, that are beyond the UI. You're going into like
Yeah.
the user's journey, right? And so those, we kind of have to just balance it in terms of looking at it over an extended period of time and building it up much slowly until we're able to bring it into an experiment process.
I love that. What's your take on the future outlook of growth design and the opportunities that continue to emerge within the field? How do you reckon the field will evolve given more time?
I think it would definitely become much more widespread. The thing with growth design is, if I were to use like an analogy, like growth design practice is there to get more juice out of the squeeze, right? So if you think about one difference between core and growth, is a lot of times core is building something like a new feature, introducing a new feature, and that's to kind of differentiate the product from the competition out there. But in growth, we're looking at what's already existing in the product and trying to get more users to adopt certain features, certain behaviors that lead to ultimately more revenue for the business, right? And so, like, in that sense, I think it will become much more widespread because a lot more companies are, they've done the work to differentiate themselves from the competition. Now they just need to do the work to stay in business, if you will, by making more of the revenue that keeps them in business and keeps them, sort of keeps the lights on. So it definitely will become much more widespread. And a lot of times that could be as a factor of maturity of the product. But then also, I think, with AI, right? So I was at a conference a couple weeks back, and one thing that was mentioned around this is the application of AI allows you as a designer to operate at a higher altitude. So it can
Yeah.
take care of, the much more
Granular.
granular, like day-to-day activities that a designer would
Mm.
perform, so that you can sort of shift your perspective a lot higher and start to tackle much more sort of systemic problems, much more complex problems. And so it frees up your time, if you will, in pushing those pixels to deal with much meatier problems within the product, right? So I think growth design will definitely become a lot more widespread, and you can provide more value to the business.
Yeah, I really love that.
Yeah.
Thank you so much. This has been a really great episode. And just to recap, we have talked about finding new opportunities within an existing design role. And we've also talked about how your journey into growth has helped you expand your mindset. And we've talked about some challenges that you've experienced. And more importantly, I love your thought process around how you relate to receiving mentorship. I think one thing to be said about designers, there seems to be a race towards being the one providing the mentorship. And I think it's just as important to know that you should continue to seek areas for improvement by
Yeah.
finding people who are much farther ahead and listening to their shared experiences. And
Absolutely.
so finally, this brings us into the lightning round. Are you ready?
I think so. Let's do it.
Okay. Top three products that you use daily and you love.
I mean, I'll say ChatGPT number one, and then I would say there's this site I go to called landbook.com, and if you're
Oh,
familiar, but yeah,
yes.
it's kind of like you get to just see different designs of products and websites. I use
Yeah,
that for
absolutely.
inspiration, and
Mhm.
then I don't know if this counts, but it's like I'm on Medium a lot, so I love just
Ah,
reading
Really?
a lot of these
yeah.
articles by leaders and thought leaders in the space. So I think those would
Mhm.
be my three.
Nice. Yes, I absolutely agree with all three of them. I would not edit anything out, to be honest. They're easily my top there,
All
top
right.
10. So, what's one design resource? I know you've mentioned Landbook, for example, but what's another design resource that you keep going back to?
ADP list is a resource, right? So I would say ADP list. Just the wealth
Good one.
of experience and knowledge that you have access to, unfettered access for literally free, right? I think the mentors on there. I know you're a mentor on there as well. I think you mentors on there are doing doing the industry a huge service. So I'm definitely taking advantage of that resource.
Yeah. Honestly, I'm both a mentor and mentee on the platform, to be fair.
Don't worry, I'll come and book you in soon to mentor me.
Same, same.
Okay, three books that you like to recommend.
Okay. Well, I guess I jumped the bag on that one. I've mentioned two already. Atomic
Yeah.
Habits, How to Change by Caddy Milkman. The third book, I mean, I don't have like something specific to growth design, but I wanted to make a recommendation for, I guess, folks who are, wanting to understand growth design a bit more. There's a talk that I was able to attend here in Toronto actually a few years back by Chaitna Diora, because I know you
Okay.
guys mentioned her as well.
Yeah.
So it's called Leading Growth Design, and it's on the Design X Community YouTube channel.
Yeah.
I think
Yeah.
she goes through like a really good like primer, and even like a bit
Yeah.
of depth on what growth design is all about. So yeah, I recommend that. It's something that I keep going back to.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah, I
Yeah.
agree with you. Yeah, it's just speaking of Chitana, there's also the Growth series,
Mm.
which I also find myself going back to. It's just a huge collection of different talks around growth design. And I think it's really solid. Yeah, but we'll definitely link it in the show notes. All right. Okay, so what profession will you be in instead of your current one?
Most likely something like a different discipline in design.
Still in design.
I've thought about like fashion design.
Oh,
I've thought
we
about
should
like,
talk.
I know, right? You definitely, we definitely should. I've thought about like architecture, so I think it'll still be something that involves being creative, like, yeah,
Yeah,
creating products. Yeah.
I love it. Okay, for the last two, what's your favorite food and what's your favorite movie?
Favorite food.
I say Nigerian.
I was just debating now. Like, so, I mean, now that you say it, I think I'll go with jollof rice.
Oh,
They've like,
I
if there's,
set you up.
I know, if there's one thing that Nigeria is known for, it's jollof rice. So that's one. I think the other
Nice.
one I would say is spaghetti and corned beef. That's like my bachelor food because of how
Spaghetti and
easy
what?
corned beef.
Corned beef, I guess.
Yeah,
It's corned beef. Oh,
yeah,
okay.
yeah.
Yeah, really bad. Really bad.
Yeah, I
The
mean,
judgment
like,
is the
yeah, it's very accessible and easy to put together. So, and then for
Nice.
favorite movie,
Avengers.
which one?
Yeah, don't worry, don't worry. Just quiet.
Don't
I
worry,
Uh,
read to one of I went to one of your articles, so there's a movie you keep talking about there. So
oh, okay, okay, Avengers. I see where you're going now. Okay, no,
yeah.
but I think anything from Guy Ritchie. So if you're familiar with
Mm.
like King Arthur, Rock and Roller,
yeah.
Oh,
Snatch with Brad Pitt.
Mm-hmm.
I just like
Mm-hmm.
his like the flair he brings to storytelling. So
Mm.
yeah, I would say anything from Guy Ritchie.
Nice, nice. Okay. I think we're going to stop calling these rounds lightning questions because they're never fast enough. So,
I
um,
guess yeah.
but yeah, it's been so amazing having you. And my God, you brought a lot of knowledge. And I
Thank you
cannot
for
wait for
having me.
people to dig into this episode. Thank you so much.
Thank you for having me. I had a blast with you both. I think this podcast occupies a really great space, especially for growth design, being what it is, in its still early days. I'm glad this podcast exists. Yeah.
amazing. Thanks so much, Shagun, and it's been a very, very wonderful episode. Thank you guys. Talk to you guys soon.
Bye.